Hello, and welcome to the No Contest Off Tour podcast, where we take you behind the scenes to the new Stab and RedBull Media House series. I'm Tyler Breuer from the Swell Season Surf podcast, and we are here with the director and show host of the No Contest series, Ashton Goggans.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. I'm excited to talk about the new show.
Stoked to have you here. Ashton, where are we going on this episode?
We're already here.
We're already here, right?
The first episode of this series was shot in New York City and Long Island, to be fair. But yeah, the first episode is about New York, which is a place that's very near and dear to my heart. When I first moved here 15 years ago as a kid going to college, you were one of the first guys that I met. And the New York surf scene, in a weird way, is fairly responsible for pretty much any good thing that's happened to me ever since, as far as the surf industry goes. It all sort of stems from this little place.
So let's first, before we dive into this location, let's discuss, like, how is this series different than the past No Contest? It's quite a departure in the sense that you're not following the WSL tour around anymore. So how is this different?
So over the 7 years that No Contest was embedded with the World Tour, it sort of evolved from a short sort of web-based behind-the-scenes series into a more sort of serious journalistic, like, travel show, taking you behind the scenes at each location and trying to tell the story of the sort of local figures and characters that make each community what it is on the World Tour. And we did that for more or less 3 years as full-length films, 20-minute episodes. And at a certain point, we'd sort of squeezed the juice out of most of the locations or felt like we'd done enough service to each of them to move on to the myriad other international locations that have really rich surf culture and really interesting characters and like a surf community that feels like it has never really had its story told in a holistic manner from top down. And that was what we were sort of aspirationally hoping to do with the new series, was to embrace the travel aspect of it and to head to locations that had nothing to do with the World Championship Tour, but were just but were just interesting locations for someone who's interested in surfing. So
basically you get to be surfing's Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah, I've had to.
I'm a little jealous. I'm just going to say that out loud.
It was a weird thing that just sort of happened all of a sudden, being thrust on tour. It was like a 2-week warning before we started doing this, and it's now been 4 years of traveling, and it's been like the greatest joy of my life being able to do these series, because a lot of times when you go to a location to film a surf film, it's you flying in with famous pro surfers, filming at the different waves, and then leaving. And the real story is the experience that those surfers have with the locals that are their guides and their sort of go-to people that they've been working with at each of those locations every time they've ever gone there to surf, or, the people who've built and carry the local surf culture on their backs and have since, whenever those areas were sort of pioneered or wherever the surf community developed. And those were always the stories that were my favorite to tell when we were on tour. And so given the opportunity to just sort of look at the sort of dizzying array of places that you could choose, we sort of narrowed them down into categories and whittled it down to a list of locations that we thought were really diverse, that showed sort of the spectrum of what is available today as far as international surf communities and destinations.
So there was no dartboard and a map on a wall then?
No, I wish. It is definitely like one of those moments that you imagine your teenage self fantasizing about. You're like, imagine if they just said, pick 6 places that you could go, pick your surfers and figure it out. And that's a little bit what it felt like. It felt like trying to put together something between an Anthony Bourdain show and a Bruce Brown film. And I don't know if we've accomplished that, but those are the two stars that we were steering by.
So let's just get into it now. This episode is featured and focused solely on New York surfing, correct?
Yeah, the first location that we went to, we flew from Hawaii straight into a snowstorm with Balaram and spent 4 days driving about 1,000 miles chasing waves in this area. And
listeners, there's only about 111 miles of coastline in New York. Let's just put that out there. So you do the math.
Yeah, I wonder if people will call us out for where we surf. But to me, that was always what was so amazing about being a New York surfer, is being centralized within striking distance of so many amazing waves and still 40 or 50 minutes from New York City. And to experience that with Balaram, like the full 4-day like cannonball run, I've never seen anyone willing to work harder under harder conditions with like an absolutely like unbreakable spirit than Balaram. He is one of the gnarliest, fucking grittiest surfers that I've ever been around. And watching him like in his element in a blizzard for 3 days, like cracking the whip on Tosh Tudor and all these kids that were with him that were just like little puppy dogs trying to keep up, just like hammering them. What the fuck are you doing? You're 2 hours behind. You're going to miss it. Why do you even try? And I love that East Coast spirit, because those were my favorite surfers growing up, were like guys like Corey Lopez, who they chased waves. All they wanted to do was go get barreled, and they knew how to read forecasts. Like they could read forecasts in between the lines to know where it was going to be good. And in the 3 days that we got to surf with Ball, we scored the best East Coast that I've ever seen. And I had a blown out knee from Hawaii, and I was like trying to pig dog with a busted knee through like the most roping left-hand beach break barrels that I've seen on the East Coast since I was like a little kid.
And again, winter storm, full gear, by the way.
Yeah.
Let's explore then, like, why New York? What was it that put it on your radar? Or obviously you mentioned you'd spent time here, but what made it appealing to show as part of this series?
New York surfing to me feels like its own almost unique category in a lot of ways when it comes to like the types of surf communities that exist around the world. I feel like New York is unlike anywhere else on the planet. And it's not just because it's the biggest city that's located on a coast that has waves in my mind. I think it's more about the types of people that it attracts, and then the way that those types of people that New York attracts interact with the locals who are born and raised here. Because I feel like what makes this place great is the acceptance of that cross-pollination and the ability for New York to morph and absorb all this influence and create something that's completely different than where any of those people came from, that feels entirely theirs. And I remember when I first came here, 16 years ago as a college kid, feeling like what made it special was the people that came through and interacted with the locals, seeing, meeting all the heads from up here that had been a part of New York surfing since the 70s and 80s, and then seeing the treatment that those guys gave to the traveling surfers that were coming through to engage with New York surfing. It was like a blueprint for me for how surfing can become this like international network of brains and creative people, and how a community can benefit from visitors. Instead of it being a closed off, localized scene, it always felt like, to me, the most inclusive environment for someone coming through. Everyone wanted to tell you where to go to eat. They wanted to tell you where they were going to surf in the morning, where to get a slice of pizza, like who's the guy that's been there forever. It was like everyone was so quick to share that cultural capital here, that for me as a filmmaker, knowing all those characters and knowing the lattice work that makes New York surfing so intricate and complicated and cool, it was like so exciting for them to greenlight it and for us to be able to dive in and start piecing together who the characters were going to be, that we could sort of help tell the story. Because you could make a film every week about New York surfing with new characters and never, ever finish it. Because I feel like there's new ones that pop up every day. And then there's people that have been here since the 70s, or even the 60s, who are still part of this world that to a lot of people seems very foreign or almost novel, like, oh, you're a New York surfer, where I do feel like it has more culture and more sort of impact and influence on the surf community internationally than people are willing to really acknowledge.
Well, I think like the thing about New York that's interesting and unique is the fact that it's such a transient place, particularly New York City. People come to New York, they put in their time. They come here for a different reason. Most people don't come to New York to be surfers. They come here for whatever passion they're here for, whether it's in finance or whether it's art, music, whatever, dance. Like they're here for some other reason, and the surf just happens to be part of that. Something that they can do to help relax. But I've always noticed, for me as a born and bred New York surfer, the surfing goes through these phases here where there's a crew and you see familiar faces, and then in 5 years, a lot of those people either move or go somewhere else, and there's a new crew that comes in. And so New York has always been adaptable like that. New York has always had that story of, you could come here and start over. And New York does that really well. You could go and be like, oh, well, that shop used to be here 10, 15 years ago. And then the person who's here now will say in 10 or 15 years, oh, this used to be the place we used to hang. And there's always this regeneration going on in New York. And so I think it lends itself to being a pretty, I don't want to say accessible, but it's a more accepting surf community than many other places where you have more hardened, entrenched locals, basically.
Yeah, and I felt like we were able to really bring voices from all of those different sort of people into this episode, from Mike Nelson and Dave Juan at Unsound, who to my mind have probably been the most influential two guys on the like core surf scene since the 90s when they opened, and thinking about how sort of prestigious for a kid growing up in the East Coast the Unsound Pro was, and then seeing what they were able to do with the Quicksilver Pro in 2010? 2011.
Yeah.
Seeing what they were able to do with the Quicksilver Pro in 2011, to me, those were like such huge cultural milestones in surfing. And the Quicksilver Pro to me is up there with maybe 4 or 5 other events that people still talk about and remember by name. They know the Quicksilver Pro in G-Land, they know the Chopu events and maybe a Cloudbreak event here and there, and they talk about the New York event. Yeah. And it was the backdrop for so many like insane moments that people still talk about. Bobby Martinez's like send off, Owen Wright's like big breakout performance and like run, Kelly and his tractionless air reverse against Josh Kerr, or Taj Burrow, was it?
Taj.
It was just like, that's a monumental moment in surf history. And I know how much pride the New York surf scene takes in that. But I do think that with the internet's like sort of memory loss that happens, that it's very quick for people to forget that. And it was fun to go back and hear the story from Dave and Mike about how that came about. And then to see Mike's new photo book, North of Nowhere, which when I was talking to him about it, I was like, finally, because I don't think the same thing. I know that this has been a chip on his shoulder since he was young as a photographer, that people have this generalization that the East Coast doesn't get that good of waves, or that the East Coast is somehow inferior to the West Coast when it comes to wave quality. And that is the greatest hoax that you guys have ever played on the surf scene. I'm confident of it. I'm confident that it is the greatest smoke bomb in the history of surfing, that everyone pretends like New York and New Jersey isn't one of the best places to live as a surfer if you have good wetsuits, which we can get into.
Yeah. Well, let's dive like what are some of these surf spots or surf places that you covered in this episode, or ones that really are important for our listeners to kind of be familiar with?
Well, to me, I feel like Rockaway is the like pinnacle of what people think of as like New York City surfing. And we got to go and cruise around Rockaway with Kalo Handino and his crew from Reckless Isolation when they were premiering their film at the Rockaway Hotel. And that experience was a trip for me because I hadn't seen the Rockaway since it had opened a few years ago. And It's a gorgeous like luxury hotel on the beach with like a beautiful space to show films.
Insane views, by the way.
Yeah, it's baffled.
It's nuts.
Such a great place to show a surf movie. And they were blown away by it. You know, I think Kolohe had come here for the Unsound contest a few years back. Maybe it was probably even...
He won it.
Is that right?
He won it, I believe. Yeah.
I have to figure out what year that was. But yes, Kolohe was saying that he'd only been here for that contest. And you could tell he was like really, really into the scene. He loved that he had gotten to take a ferry from Rockaway into the city, cruise around Lower Manhattan, and then be back in the water at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Because again, I think a lot of people have this preconceived notion that being a surfer in New York is like almost impossible, that it's like a novelty that you think of people like going through the subway with their board and trying to get to the beach. But I've sat in traffic on the 405 for 3 times as long as I've sat on the A train waiting for, you know, a transfer from Broad Channel or something. Or what is it, Jamaica? What is this?
Yep, Broad Channel.
Yeah, See, I still remember my routes.
You got it.
And yeah, I think that it's something that it's still interesting to people that it's a thing, that there are New York City surfers. And we got to go see Chris Gentile's new shop, the new Pilgrim location is it on Williamsburg Ave?
It's on Grand.
It's on Grand.
It's on Grand now. Yeah,
so we got to go see Chris's new location for Pilgrim on Grand. And for me, that was, you know, Chris and the Mullis shop over on River Street. That like original scene was my first introduction to New York surfing.
Let's give our listeners like a bit of a background here on that, you know, because that was a very important time in New York surfing, I think. And, you know, he opened a store, Mollusk Surf Shop on River Street. It was small, and it was 2007, and no one even thought like you could really do a surf shop in that area in Brooklyn, particularly Williamsburg at that time.
Yeah, I remember I've got to see the shop about a few weeks after it first opened on my first trip to New York City. And I remember pulling up, it's on like a dead end street in the middle of Williamsburg, pre like capital W Williamsburg, the way that people think of it now. Like it was still, to my young Floridian eyes, I was like, this is what I imagined like raw Brooklyn looking like. It was like oil silos that had been abandoned and janky skate ramps that they'd sort of wedged up against the curb, and this little corner shop that looked out on the East River. And I was like, this is heaven. Like, this is paradise. If you live in New York, this is like the coolest street corner on the planet. And then I remember going to the first film premiere that Chris did. I forget what movie it was. It might have even been a premiere. I think it was when Joe Curran came to sign his book, and Tom came
and played. Yeah, at like 11 at night.
I think that was like the first 3 months that I lived in New York. And when I moved to New York, I was like, I'm going to college for writing. I'm not going to think about surfing. Like, I need to focus. And within like 3 weeks, I was like working at the shop. And then I remember that night just being like, what is this place? Like, Tom Curran just showed up out of the blue to play with his bass player on a loading dock while beyond the boundaries and Searching for Tom Curran are being projected onto a giant oil silo, while like 50 people hang out and drink out of red Solo cups and barbecue in the middle of New York City. I was like, this is fucking crazy. And like I said, I think that experience like shaped how I perceived what's possible through a surf community, and how it can bring energy into a scene and expose people to new ideas and create like a real capital C community. And I think that's really coalesced in Brooklyn around what Chris and Mike and everyone that felt a part of that scene really brought to it, and has carried it to what it is today. To see his new shop, the place is like a cathedral to surfing. It's one of the most beautiful surf shops on the planet. It has to be.
It's stunning. It's really nice. So listeners, when you do come through New York, it's kind of necessary to go stop at Pilgrim. You know, if you're a surfer, you kind of need to go by there and check out some beautiful boards, some great clothing, and friendly people too. You know, he's got a great staff there, which you did interview actually. As well.
That's what I was just going to say is Chris has always had the most incredible. I mean, I'm not saying this just because I work there, but I feel like Chris has always been a host to all these great characters that have wanted to come and work at the shop that have all these other things going on in their lives, like you were talking about. It's always been the shop that took in misfits from wherever they were, if they were interested in creativity and culture and surfing, and if they could tolerate Chris's wildly eclectic vinyl collection. And to walk in there now, I always get nervous that like a surf shop's going to lose that, that feeling of you being excited to talk to the person that's behind the counter if it's not the people that you knew originally. And it's so nice walking into that shop and talking to that whole crew. And we got to do a profile on Joanie Capetta. Is that how you say?
Yeah.
Is that how you say Joanie's last name?
Yeah.
And Benny's Club, which, I mean, I'll let Joanie explain it, but to see how Chris has created a space that everyone feels comfortable using as their own platform and bringing their own communities into the shop and being open to whatever that is, to me, that's like the real, like, those are the ingredients and like the dynamic for a surf shop to feel like a real like center of the surf scene in any town. And yeah, I'm really proud of how their version of surf culture through that shop, to me, is a blueprint for a real type of community surf scene.
And you also had the opportunity to speak to an incredible writer, too, who has written for the New York Times. She also was like a founding editor at Vibe magazine as well. And, and also can speak to a lot of like the diversity that's happened in the lineup in Rockaway. Diane Cardwell. How was that meeting her?
Diane was so wonderful to speak with and to cruise around Rockaway with. She's lived out here for a few years, and her book about learning how to surf as an adult and a Black woman, which is, I think, is it titled Rockaway?
Yeah, Rockaway Beach, yeah.
Headlong into a New Life. It had just gotten optioned for a film that they were making, for a proper Hollywood film. And
Kerry Washington.
Is that right?
Yeah, optioned it. Kerry Washington optioned it.
And she's just such an interesting thinker and had done such incredible research into the histories of sort of African connections to surf culture and the history of, just sort of beach culture in general in Rockaway, from a sort of, however you want it, from a critical standpoint, coming from that perspective. It gave me a completely new prism to look at Rockaway through that has made me appreciate Rockaway even more for what it is, as far as it being for sure the most diverse surf community on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. I can't think of anywhere where you'd see more, whatever you want to call them, categories represented in the lineup than there. Poor, rich, white, Black, every bit of the spectrum is represented in New York surfing today. And that's really, really unique. And the fact that everyone feels so comfortable and proud of that. It doesn't feel like there's any old grumbly people upset that there's these new faces in the lineup that look different than the ones they grew up with, which was, I think, always a fear in a place like this, that there would be that surfing would feel like some other sports in big cities where it's very exclusive to certain communities. Surfing should be universal. And you guys do it right here.
It's really cool, and I'll say to this, like, it is definitely one of the most diverse lineups I've ever surfed in, but also like probably one of the more, I don't want to say chill lineups, but definitely like everyone's attitude tends to be somewhat positive in the water, and there's very rarely a whole lot of like angst and grumblings from people, and if there are, it tends to get handled pretty easily. And I think one of the reasons is because New York is such a diverse place, you don't know who you could be getting into an argument with in the lineup. You could be like, I'm all pissed off at this person. And then you find out, that person is so-and-so or does this or that, and you're like, oh, fuck, well,
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just be nice just in case, because I don't know if this is going to be a cop or a fireman or anyone, that might help me in the future, or might be a cool person that I might meet on land. So I think that actually helps in regulating the lineup and keeping everything civil to a certain point. Plus, honestly, like there's a lot of entry-level surfers, so there's like some kook camouflage that works in your advantage if you can work a crowd.
Yeah, I think that the only place that comes close as far as like diversity would be Malibu, and the same thing goes there, where you're like, oh, you never know who you're dropping in on, but that's because they're worried that it's like a Hollywood agent.
Yeah.
In New York, you're worried that it's going to be the guy that pulls you over,
Yeah.
or who like breaks down your door if a fire happens.
Yeah.
I do think that Rockaway and Long Island in general has always had one of the coolest like working class civil servant cultures of surfing. I've never known a place where there's more firefighters and police and teachers and, nurses and, emergency staff. Everyone out here, I feel like, does some sort of public service job.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of them get really good benefits that allow them to surf a bit too.
The schedule's not bad.
So while you were filming this, though, you did have some adventures, correct? And I want to take some of our listeners behind the scenes, like what it took to shoot this episode.
Yeah.
You definitely had some harrowing experiences.
Yeah, I almost killed Balaram and Sam Moody.
Not maliciously.
And Tosh Tudor. Driving back into New York City through a blizzard, hit black ice, and slid off of the freeway down a like bridge embankment that was covered in snow onto an entirely new on-ramp on the freeway, and somehow didn't die. Had to get pulled out by a very kind stranger in a snowstorm. That this is prime example of why New York is amazing. We got stuck in the snow at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday. Full traffic, blizzard. In 10 minutes, we had 3 people stop and see if we were okay. And the third one had a winch and a 4-wheel drive truck and pulled us out. And we were back on the road in less than 10 minutes.
Wow.
And if you get into an accident or something happens on the freeway in California, people will run you over before they'll stop. They will fucking mow your car down before they try and lend you a hand. And so it was terrifying, but yeah, floating over ice in Balaram's giant Toyota Tundra. But that was like the culmination of 4 days of barely sleeping, driving through the night in the snow, surfing in, sub-freezing conditions and hurricane force winds in 3 feet of snow for 3 days. So it was a very strange exclamation point at the end of that trip.
So let's break down the local economics of surfing in New York.
New York is definitely a somewhat cost prohibitive place to visit if you are trying to travel and surf on a budget. It's the best place on the planet to have a friend with a couch.
Yes.
Which I'm always very thankful for, the myriad friends who let me crash when I come through. But yeah, if you're coming to New York, I think you can choose and really benefit either way from staying in the city and doing strike missions out to surf, or coming and staying in Rockaway for a few days and just getting a feel for what it's like to be in that scene for a little bit. I've never stayed in Long Beach except for staying at Balaram's mom's house, Mary. I know that there's a new film coming out that Ball just finished making that is about his mom that you should all go see as well.
Hail Mary.
But I just think that being able to bomb up and down Long Island from Rockaway to Montauk is a like surf trip that anyone, let me say that again. Being able to go on a surf trip to New York City and then spend a few days bombing from Rockaway out to Montauk, to me is something that every like sort of culturally interested serious surfer should do. It's such a unique experience, and there's so many different types of waves that you can score if you come here the right time of year. I always encourage people to like suck it up and go during the winter, because it's the only place I can think of that time of year that you can go and get barreled by yourself on a pretty cheap domestic flight. And flights are cheap into JFK. You can get a taxi to your buddy's house out in Rockaway for 60 or 70 bucks,
or a subway,
or hop on the train for $3. And then, you can spend $800 on a Japanese wetsuit, or you can go buy a nice $300 or $400 Volcom suit. A 4.3 with a hood is pretty much what I stick to, but everyone thinks I'm nuts. I know Tosh had like a 6 mil Japanese suit for our trip, but New York is unique in that, like, depending on what season you come, you could need pretty much every wetsuit that you own. From this time of year right now, it's warm, it starts to cool off quick. You go from a spring suit into a full suit in a matter of like 2 weeks, and then you're in a 4.3 a month later. So it can get expensive as far as gear goes, but I think you can eliminate some of the middle ground in those suits and go with.
And there are rentals.
Is that
Believe
right?
it or not, there are rentals in Rockaway. You can get it from a couple different places. Station RBNY. You can get it from Breakwater. There's a bunch of different shops that you can go and visit and actually rent not just wetsuits, but boards as well. So if you are here on a family trip even, or whatever, or even a business trip, and there just happens to be waves, you can actually hop on the subway and get gear and be in the water in no time. So pretty convenient, actually.
I had no idea about that. That's like information that I feel like I need to provide to so many people that send me text messages throughout the year. Oh, I'm going to New York. Do you know anybody that has a board I can borrow or a wetsuit? Like, no one wants to lend you a wetsuit.
Yeah. The wetsuits get cleaned, I believe. So it's
but your friends' wetsuits don't get cleaned.
Let's talk. Really, what's important though is how much you're paying for food and slices, particularly.
You have to go for a slice. I mean, I feel like people have had New York pizza at this point all over the world, but to me, like, when I think of New York pizza, I think of grandma's pie.
Yeah.
As far as being something that when you first bite into it, you're like, I've never tasted anything like this anywhere else on the planet. And Gino's grandma's pie is probably my favorite.
Gino's of Long Beach. It is a custom, basically. If you go surf Long Beach, it's right across from the Long Island Railroad, which is very convenient. And if you've surfed a full day, nothing is going to make you feel any better than stopping by Gino's, getting a nice slice. There's also some good places in Rockaway to get a slice. You got Wits End. You have Boardwalk Pizza. So there's a couple spots there. And then, of course, if you go into the city, you've got a whole host of places to go check out. We could provide a whole list in the show notes if you'd like. But
do you have that on a Google Doc, like, to copy and paste when people ask? Because that's like the one thing that I feel like must get so old, is being like, which way do you want to go? Up, down, sideways? Like,
I used to, when I ran the Surf Film Festival here in New York, I would provide all the filmmakers a list of all the pizza places to go check out. And if the waves are flat, what you can do is get a city bike, start at the top of Manhattan up in Inwood, and just do a pizza tour all the way down. I mean, not a bad way to spend the day. So that's the other thing we should mention. If the surf is flat, which does happen on a semi-regular basis, there's so much more to do. So that makes it a little bit more enjoyable.
On both these trips, the waves were so good that we were like struggling to make time to go do all the things that we wanted to do. And I think that was a big surprise for everyone on all 3 trips that we did for shooting this episode. Was, in September, Kolohe and all the boys were so pumped that they had 2 days of just like perfect, punchy beach break ramps. And then Balaram and Tosh and everyone scored during the blizzard. And then we came back in the spring and got waves with Joanie and Chris and Charlie Mansell.
Yeah. Oh, Mansell.
Charlie, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me say
Professor Mansell.
And Professor Mansell, the young professor. Yeah, I got to ride some of his boards. We had the sickest session. I was like, man, I've gotten all, because I think of New York being kind of a 3-season surf zone.
Yeah.
In a weird way. Similar to a lot of the East Coast, where there is a large window from say June till now, where it can be pretty desperate.
Now being September.
But then 9 months, 9 months out of the year, you guys have waves fairly consistently, if not really consistently. And I do feel like it's one of the most like consistent hollow spots. Like I feel like you can get barreled here more days per year than most places you could live in California or anywhere else on the East Coast besides maybe the Outer Banks.
I like in New York surfing and East Coast surfing in some ways. If you were to compare it to West Coast, West Coast is agricultural. They can plan their surfs. They can bank on there being waves at certain days, and they can plan their day around it. East Coast, and particularly New York, New Jersey, we're hunters and gatherers, and we have to just feast or famine. So when there are waves, we feast until we gorge ourselves, and when it's flat, I mean, it is famine, So we find other things to keep us involved in surfing or preoccupied. That's how I would describe it, and for sure, like it can be flat or it could be pumping or it can be in between. We get a wide variety of conditions, and we don't let it go to waste for sure.
You guys don't. You guys are the hungriest surfers on the earth.
So what sort of resources should people, if they want to surf here, where should they go? Where can they go to get information?
Coming to New York, I would walk straight into Unsound or Pilgrim and start picking somebody's brain. If you need gear, they have anything you could need as far as wetsuits, booties. Even through the scarcity of the pandemic, I think most of those guys had a full stock of, whatever they could find from all the brands as far as wetsuit, booties, and gloves. Invest in multiple wetsuits if you have the luxury of doing so, because from, I would say, November until April, putting on a cold wetsuit is usually the biggest barrier to entry to getting in the water. I think that people have a misconception that when the water is super cold that it is miserable, but with modern wetsuits, it's surprisingly very, very tolerable and almost warm most of the time if you have a dry wetsuit to put on, so that the point A to point B parking lot to water situation doesn't freeze you out before you get moving.
And you can also go to Scoot and Surf, which has surf school, and they can always provide information. Local Surf as well is another one in Rockaway, which is great to go check out if you want information. You could go look at those two places. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of surf shops actually in New York you can check out and get all the information that you want. And then, I enjoyed this episode very much, Ashton. Not just saying it because I'm featured in it and I'm happen to be a New York surfer, but, I feel like it really captured a good essence of the place and who the characters are. And honestly, like you said, you could make an episode a week and still find something new on it. So it's awesome. And I love this new direction that you've taken No Contest in. And I am looking forward to the next episodes and discussing them with you. So listeners, stay tuned because we're going to have more episodes as they launch. So please stick around and follow us. And where else can people find No Contest? No Contest Off Tour. Where can they find No Contest Off Tour?
So the show premieres September 29th on RedBull TV and on YouTube. It will be released in 3-episode chunks, with the second 3 being released in November. We're just finishing filming the last episode 6. And the first 3 we're really excited to share with everybody.
So stick around to find out where we go next for No Contest Off Tour. And hope you enjoy this new podcast that accompanies it.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Tyler. This is killer.
Stoked, Ashton. Thank you. And for all listeners, we'll catch you on down the line soon.